This is next thing that happened. God said to Moses, "You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you." So what do you think about that?
I wonder what this God to harden Pharaoh's heart. Could he have power to harden his heart, as he was a fallen nature?
So this is something people struggle with, and people often say, "Well, was Pharaoh free or not free?"
Yeah.
Okay, this is an important question. Was Pharaoh free or not free? What is going on here?
Not free.
Well, let's have a look at it, okay? Let's suspend the answer and then see what happens and understand here the difference between what I didn't talk about that last slide from this morning, difference in the philosophical way of analysing freedom and things like that, and the narrative way of analysing these things. Okay, so first question is, well, anyway, these are the plagues, the 10 plagues. Blood, frogs, flies, livestock death, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of the Egyptian firstborn. So do you think these things happen or not?
Happen. They happen.
Why do you think they happened?
Otherwise, there wouldn't be that outcome. Okay.
All right. Okay. Anyway, sometimes people, wonder, well, maybe it's all just made up. Sometimes people think, well, the Bible was written, quite relatively recently, just a few thousand years ago. How can it possibly contain true information, true knowledge from 3,500 years ago? People often say these things are impossible, it couldn't have possibly happened, it's just made up. Anybody think that?
No.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good German. Yeah. Very practical. No, that couldn't have happened. Right. Okay, good answer.
Well, actually, we talked about that, right? Like, we talked about stories before, right?
Yeah.
You leave a message for posterity on rules and ethics and so on. So what's really important is that there are to be pharaohs and they become real, right? The example you gave of the sister that wanted to go and be to the concentration camp because of stories as well that reinforce something that we have inside.
Yes.
So, to me, I might be totally wrong, but the stories of the Bibles, a lot of them were written for that purpose, to leave guidance. So did it happen really? To me, it's not that important.
Okay, but it'd be interesting to know if it did or not. And then, of course, there are these ethical issues. I'm personally wondering, has it got any historical basis, or are they just stories? Are they just fairy stories, which are incredibly important? Do you know why Britain voted to leave the European Union? No, seriously, why do you think Britain voted to leave the European Union?
I don't know, disinformation?
Yes.
That would be ruled by some...
Okay, it's very simple. If you want to understand why Britain voted to leave the European Union, even though everyone said it'll be a disaster, even though Obama came and the IMF and the World Bank and the EU's, everyone came and told the British people it'll be a disaster, you mustn't do it, they still voted to leave. Do you know why? It's all to do with stories. Do you know what the dominant... Hi, Sarah. Oh, and hi, what's your name? Sorry. Lina, that's right. Thank you. I remember you from Chompion. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Talking about this at lunch. The dominant character in an English fairy story, which you don't find in the fairy stories of any other country, is someone called Jack. Jack and the Beanstalk. Okay, so this is the stories that English children are read when they're children. And I identify with Jack. What does Jack do? Jack kills giants. Yes? This is the English sense of who we are. We are giant killers. Yes? We kill Napoleon, we kill Hitler, Kaiser. That's what we do. We're not afraid of anybody. Yes? And so when all these people come along and say, you mustn't do it, it'll be disaster, huh? We're English. This is the core to understand why they voted to leave the European Union, despite being told it will be a disaster, disaster, disaster. That's it.
Have you killed EU now?
Sorry?
Have you killed EU now?
It's the beginning.
Just wait and see what happens. Do you want to join the Euro? No. Hands up here. Anybody wants to join the Euro?
We are already there. Finland.
Oh, you're from Finland.
Actually, it's the opposite. They want to. I look at the envy the Swedes. They don't. They're not in the Euro. So.
Oh, that's right. No Swedish people want to join the Euro now. Okay. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But what I'm saying is, if you look at French fairy stories, the dominant motif there, it's all Cinderella and marrying a princess, it's all romance and love, etc. German fairy stories, it's all this deep stuff that I can't understand, the Hansel and Gretel and...
The hero gets killed at the end.
Okay, all right. But there's lots of other funny, stuff going on. So every country then has its own characteristic fairy stories which represent the culture, the values and the attitudes of that country. And it's through these fairy stories that these things are transmitted and passed on from generation to generation.
And we love them.
Sorry?
We love them.
Of course we do. Because they are who we are. Yeah? They're close to us. They express who we are, and there we find ourselves in these stories. And we act according to the different characters in these stories. That's why these stories are so important. And it's really important which stories we teach our children. Yeah? And when I lived in Russia for 7 years, I read Russian fairy stories. A typical Russian fairy story is there's the bear, Misha the bear, and Misha the bear comes out of his cave, out of hibernation, and he meets a fox, and he gets tricked and deceived over and over again. At the end, when the winter comes, he goes back into his cave. But there's no justice. There's no resolution, he just gets tricked. So that is the Russian experience of life. You cannot, it is. You cannot expect to find justice in this world. Life is unjust, you just have to endure, persevere, and that's it. And that's the character, that's the history, that's the way in which they... And I thought, okay, I'm not going to read that story to my kids. Because I don't want my children to develop this way of looking at the world, yes? And, sorry, can I...
Sorry, no, yeah, I have to push this. I forgot.
Should I start again? All right. That makes sense? That's why the story is so important, and how we tell these stories is so important, And when I teach second gen, I say to kids I'm teaching second gen, I said, when I look at you, I'm not thinking about you, I'm thinking about your grandchildren. What stories are you going to teach your grandchildren? What stories are our children going to teach their children? Yes? And are they going to find the principle and these stories living in them in such a way they can pass on these stories from generation to generation? Stories which can help them to discover God and to find God living in their own lives. And just like this Jewish, these two sisters I told you, such that these stories, they live out these stories, yes, in the right way. Yeah, and that's why it's so important. That's why I said last year I told the stories very differently than the way I was told the stories. So the way I teach these stories now is very different than the way I was taught these stories. And as I explained last year, I think the way we've understood and used these stories within our spiritual community has often been very damaging.
Doesn't these stories also reflect our character?
Yeah.
That we inherited?
That's right. And then we need to change that. So the story should help us to change. Yes.
What's the Korean story?
The Korean story?
Their fairy tales. What is
Well, they're fairy tales about filial piety, about a daughter whose father's sick and is willing to sacrifice her life. And it's not just Korean, you find it in Chinese fairy stories. I don't know if they're fairy stories, they're actual real stories. When there's, parents are sick, then the model is that, a Chinese or Korean girl is expected, if necessary, to cut a piece of flesh off her thigh and to cook it and to serve it to the parents if there's not enough food to go around. and the one that does it the most is regarded as the best child. You can read Chinese fairy stories. That's the model for filial piety, is you're willing to chop off part of your body and cook it to feed your parents. For me, no. So for me, if, for example, I got kidney failure, I would absolutely refuse to accept a kidney from my kids. If my kids got kidney failure, I'll be happy to give my kidney to my children. You know what I'm saying? I would say it's just different. There are different kinds of filial piety. The biblical stories of filial piety are also different than the Korean ones. But that's the Korean dominant motif, is this kind of filial piety in practice in this kind of way. There are problems. That ship that sank with all the kids, and it's heartbreaking, but a lot of these things are connected to the weaknesses in Korean culture and stories, basically. Okay, so if you're interested in this, there was Professor Sir Colin John Humphreys, the former Goldsmiths Professor of Material Science at the University of Cambridge, Professor of Experimental Physics at the Royal Institution in London. So he's a serious scientist. He's also a Christian, and he reads the Bible, and he wanted to know, is there any basis for these things? Yes? Are you interested in this? Whether there's any historical evidence for the plagues or not? Okay. Ooh, I need some sound.
Some of the folks in town are worried that this is a sort of plague.
As in Old Testament plague?
As in God, Moses, the whole deal.
I could give you 100 reasons why your river's turned red.
Well, that's great. All I need is one.
Wanna talk plagues? Let's talk plagues.
Over 3,000 years ago, in the time of the Pharaohs, a series of catastrophes befell the land of Egypt. These events are told in the Old Testament book of Exodus. Could they have really happened? The story of the 10 plagues has fascinated and mystified scholars throughout the centuries. And this mystery has become irresistible for scientists who want to explain what may at first seem inexplicable.
You find positions from across the spectrum, from those who take a very strict historical perspective that everything happened just exactly like it said in the text, to the other extreme where nothing that's talked about in the text actually happened, that it's legendary or some other such word. And a number of us want to find our way between those two extremes.
The Bible is a very strange book in lots of ways. Even biblical scholars in the last 150 years have been emphasizing how very strange it is, because for one thing, it's not one kind of literature, it's many, many different kinds of literature. It's poetry, short story, history in part, chronology.
When we're beginning to plan out an investigation, what you do is say, let's first of all see what it is that we have to explain.
About 10 years ago, I happened to read a letter in a British journal called The Lancet, in which alluded to the 10 plagues of Egypt. And I wondered if anyone had bothered to look at rational explanations for each of the 10 plagues.
Well, I got really interested in the Exodus story because I'm a believer and I'm also a scientist. I thought, well, science has got a real input to make here because the Bible's describing these natural events, extraordinary natural events, and so I thought, can there be scientific explanations behind these events?
It's a mystery as to, did this story really happen just like this?
The eruption of Santorini was one of the biggest eruptions of the last few thousand years. It ejected something like maybe 25 cubic miles of debris into the atmosphere, and it definitely affected the whole of the eastern Mediterranean. There's no doubt about that. It is known that the ash found in the area of the Nile comes from Santorini because chemically the composition is identical to the composition of the ashes found on the remains of Santorini itself. So you'd have had this steady build-up of activity over a period maybe of months, and that could have led to a range of phenomena occurring in Egypt. The fallout may have caused the river water to change its composition in some way to allow algae to grow, an algal bloom which could have been reddish in colour.
There's a modern phenomenon called a red tide. What it is, it's due to algae, which if the conditions are right, they can bloom and they turn a bright red colour, and some of them emit toxins. These are called harmful algae, and these harmful algae will kill fish.
The next group of plagues, if you like, the frogs and the lice and the flies, maybe they're all related to some problem with the ecosystem caused by the impact of the eruption on the river.
Fish were and are a major check on the ecosystem. So if you have tadpoles that are allowed to mature, you may have a massive explosion of amphibia.
Uneaten eggs turned into record numbers of baby frogs who subsequently fled to the land and died. Their little rotting frog bodies attracted lice and flies.
The Aramaic term for lice could have been any small biting insect, anything.
By looking at the science of what happens and looking what the subsequent plagues are, we can come to what this particular gnat was, and it was a biting midge.
This biting insect affected both humans and animals, suggested that the insect involved was not a louse. A human flea doesn't bite a dog, and a dog flea doesn't bite a human. The same is true of lice. If you begin to look at the sequence about the fish dying and the frogs proliferating, the frogs dying and the midges, then you would have an environment in which there would be a lot of proteinaceous decaying matter, which would allow a fly to also proliferate into massive swarms. The question is, what kind of flies?
Stable flies swarm, and they're really unpleasant because they bite. And not only do they bite, their bite leaves open wounds on human flesh and on animal flesh. Now, the fifth plague was the death of the livestock.
The lice carried the blue tongue virus, which killed 70% of Egypt's livestock.
So the biting midge, which is the third plague, can give rise to the fifth plague of the death of the livestock, and these specific livestock.
The sixth plague, boils and blains, not just one thing, boils and blains, affected the Egyptians and their animals.
I believe that was called by the fourth plague, which was a plague of flies, because the stable fly inflicts painful bites, which when infected, they lead to boils. So it fits beautifully together. So the fourth plague led to the sixth plague.
This is potentially quite easy to explain in the context of a volcanic eruption, because when you have a huge amount of ash pumped into the atmosphere, the ash acts as nuclei for water droplets to form, and those water droplets, if they're carried high enough up, will freeze and they will form hailstones. So torrential rainstorms and hailstorms during volcanic eruptions are not at all uncommon.
After the plague of hail was a plague of locusts. They only happen some years, and they only happen when locusts find damp ground in which to lay their eggs. And the ground has to be very damp because they lay their eggs 4 inches deep in the sand. This hailstorm was so severe, it would have drenched the land when the hailstones melted. And so I believe this is what attracted the locusts. The locusts came down, they laid their eggs, and then those locusts which are swarmed there, they just ate all the remaining grain which the hail itself hadn't damaged.
Okay. I mean, I could carry on with the next one, but if you're... The main point here, I think, is... The thing that interests me is the Bible then seems to be a fairly accurate record of an ecological catastrophe that happened. And from an environmental point of view, that you had this volcano, it's the same sort of time as the Exodus is supposed to happen, led to the river turning, and then the frogs, and one thing after another, is what you'd expect in an ecological catastrophe, disaster. So for me, it looks like, the people who wrote the Bible wrote down an accurate account of what they saw and what they experienced. Now, of course, they attributed it to God. But of course, they didn't know there was a volcano which has erupted. There's no CNN in those days, or the BBC. All they experienced is one disaster and catastrophe after another. And, just as until very recently, people used to attribute earthquakes and volcanoes to God, the God's been angry. And it's only very recently people have understood that volcanoes are caused by the tectonic plates that are moving. Yes? When there's a tsunami happened, some people said, why is God angry with people? It was just there was an earthquake under the ocean. The people who experienced this didn't know that. So if you don't have a scientific explanation, it's very easy just to attribute these things to God or to the gods. That makes sense? So, from when I read this, when I saw this, I thought, well, that's really interesting. What is written in the Bible is a surprisingly accurate account by people who were there, or who the story was passed on surprisingly accurately. So if this is probably happened, you have to think, well, pretty much many things that you find written in the Bible is probably a fairly accurate historical account. But of course there's the editorial analysis. Okay, these things happened. Well, that's the factual record. The next stage is, well, what meaning do you attribute to these, yes? And so the people who wrote it said God said this and God will do that, yes? So that was a different way of analysing it, yes? That makes sense? So the Bible then, there's lots of different levels. There's factual stuff, then there's an interpretation of the facts that took place depending upon their worldview, and then there's commentaries upon that. And it's the same with the flood. There was a flood. How do you explain it? Well, some people said, well, that's because God was angry. But then the biblical understanding is actually, there's an alternative explanation. It wasn't because the flood wasn't an expression of God's anger. The Bible tells that story differently with a different kind of interpretation, expressing about God's heart and God's love, and things like that. Woo! Yes.
Did it come from this?
Yes, I knocked it up.
Maybe I should take this away. Just give you.
Okay. All right. If you've got some tissue, I've got. Thank you. No, it's okay. Just. That's it. Right with me. Well, I have a plastic thing on it just for such things.
Here.
Thank you. That should be it.
More?
Thanks. Thank you. Anyway, that's why I have this, you see. So even though the water went all over the keyboard, then, because I anticipated it, then hopefully my computer will still live.
Shall we leave this here, or do you want it over there?
Yeah, maybe put it over there. Once is enough, thanks.
You don't need this plugged in?
That's around this side. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you, Rebecca.
Didn't get down.
No, it's fine. Okay. All right, so the question is then, was the Pharaoh free? So, of course, this raises these kind of questions. You know, can it be right to punish a Pharaoh and his people for decisions not freely made? Yes or no? Is it fair that God hardens the Pharaoh's heart and then punishes the people? Is that fair?
No, he wasn't punished.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, that all these plagues were punishments on the Egyptians, disasters. And so normally we say, well, you know, you can only be punished if you're guilty. You can only be held to be guilty if you are responsible, and you can only be responsible if you have the freedom to be responsible. So if I was kidnapped and somebody took my hand and they forced one of my fingers to go into a gun, and they put a piece of string there and they pulled my finger, so it pulled the trigger, yes, and the gun went off and a person got shot, would I be punished for that? No, because I'm not guilty. I feel terrible, but I'm not guilty because I didn't make that decision. I didn't freely make that decision. My finger was used by somebody else to kill someone. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the way it works. You know, so if God then is hardening the Pharaoh's heart, how can Pharaoh be held to be responsible? So there's no, as it says in principles, no freedom without responsibility, and there's no responsibility without the freedom to make decisions. Yeah? So what's going on? Well, let's actually have a look at this story then. So when the frogs came, then Moses went up to Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh said, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go and offer sacrifices to the Lord. If you get rid of the frogs, then you can all go and make sacrifices." The frogs went, but when the Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. So who hardened Pharaoh's heart?
Himself.
He hardened his own heart, yes? He said one thing, "I will let your people go," but then he changed his mind, yes? So by changing his mind, was he acting according to truth or not? No. He was corrupting himself because he was betraying his word, going back on his word. Then later on, there were the gnats. The gnats were on the people and animals everywhere. The magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard. He would not listen, just as the Lord had said. So there's other ones where it says about he hardened his heart. And now his advisors said, "This is God working," but he wouldn't listen to his advisors. So why not? Was that his choice or not? His choice. He chose not to pay any attention to the advice that he's receiving. Just like some dictators. You remember when, yes? Johan?
Well, I was just thinking, you showed us this video where they were explaining the scientific reasons for things. So suppose that Pharaoh had kept his promise, and then these plagues would have come anyway. How would he have felt then?
I don't know. Maybe he would have been able to cope with them better. Because it's about government. You remember when Iraq was invaded by the Americans and Saddam Hussein? Did he accept the reality or deny the reality? He was living in denial. Yes. Do you remember his minister for propaganda called Comic Ali, talking about the great victory we just won over the Americans, etc. You remember? He was just living in denial. Saddam Hussein wouldn't listen to the advice that he's been given. Yeah, it conflicted with his view of the way things were. And that's basically what the Pharaoh was doing. Whereas if the Pharaoh had listened, then maybe he could have reorganized the government so they could respond to these environmental catastrophes that were taking place, instead of refusing to, for the government to get involved and deal with the reality of this environmental catastrophe, which is going to happen anyway. Then the flies, but this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. Then when the livestock, yet his heart was unyielding and he would not let the people go. Then the hail, When the Pharaoh saw the hail had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So over and over again, it's the Pharaoh and his advisors are hardening their hearts, just as you see with dictators, just as you see with these people and their advisors. That's what they do. They make decision after decision and they harden their heart. As Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. They were becoming insane. They were becoming completely obsessed. And then, that's what Jonathan Sacks says. He's a rabbi. He says, evil has two faces. The first, turned to the outside world, is what it does to its victim. The second, turned within, is what it does to the perpetrator. Evil traps the evildoer in its mesh. Slowly but surely, he or she loses freedom and becomes not evil's master, but its slave. So by making this one decision after another, the Pharaoh is becoming more and more stubborn and more unable to accept he was wrong and to change his mind. Yeah, so he was gradually, from being a free person, he was actually in a process of losing his freedom because he's becoming more and more stubborn. In that sense, the evil thing he was doing was corrupting himself. Didn't have to become like that, but it ended up like that. And then the Lord said to Moses, go to the Pharaoh, for I've hardened his heart. So in that sense, God could see this is what the Pharaoh is going to do, and he just hardened his heart. I'm going to perform these signs. But it's interesting, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. Again, Pharaoh's officials then said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? The Pharaoh was just in his palace. He's living in complete denial. He didn't realize that actually out there, because of one calamity after another, the whole country was ruined, economically ruined. But he just refused to accept that. He refused to change. Yeah?
Like Hitler.
Like Hitler. Like anybody in the modern world today?
North Korea.
North Korea? Mugabe.
Maybe Trump too.
We can even look closer to home. What effect is the euro having upon Greece? Yeah, but the unwillingness to change. Yeah, despite the fact there's horrendous levels of unemployment amongst young people in Greece and Spain, in Portugal, incredible damage has been done. This unwillingness to say, we got it wrong, we made a mistake. At what point will they realize that the southern European economies have been ruined? Pharaoh said, then Pharaoh said, okay, go worship the Lord your God, but tell me who'll be going. And then Moses said, well, we're all going to go. And Pharaoh said, no, only have the men go and worship the God. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and would not let the Israelites go. And then there was the darkness. Pharaoh said, go worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go, but leave your flocks and herds behind. Moses said, no, our livestock must go too. And he wasn't willing to let them go. So this is like a process that you've gone through. So the first time you take a cigarette, do you become addicted? No. But gradually, over a period of time, a person becomes addicted. Once you become addicted to drugs or alcohol or cigarettes, can you easily say, I'm going to stop? No. You've lost your freedom. Does that make sense? It's not from one day to the next. It's just freedom is, you are free to the extent that you practice freedom. Yeah? So lying, you tell a lie, and then personal lie, institutional cover-ups, and then people are unwilling to tell the truth, to face up to the truth of their own life, their family's life, the institution which they're working. There's cover-up after cover-up. So the Pharaoh then, he became very stubborn, as I said, trapped in an obsession like a dictator, just became completely obsessed. He couldn't change. He couldn't change. In that sense, he lost his freedom. So even though he was the mightiest man in the world, he wasn't free. He lost his freedom. Yeah. So this is, as I said, it's a narrative as opposed to a philosophical account of freedom. So usually people say, is someone free or not free? And you have a philosophical discussion, it doesn't really go anywhere. But the Bible teaches about freedom through stories. Yeah? The loss of freedom takes place gradually in this kind of way. It's not that you're free or you're not free, it's, so who is mighty? As Father said himself, not one who can conquer his enemies, but one who can conquer himself. Yes, as you know, Father said, before I want to conquer the world, I have to conquer myself. The same thing. So, okay, then the death of the firstborn. God said the firstborn son will die. And then, this is interesting. Again, the next video would have gone on to explain the scientific basis for that, or possible scientific basis for it. Anyway, then during the night, the Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Leave my people, you and the Israelites, go worship the Lord. Take your flocks and herds and go, and also bless me." What's that last sentence there for? Also bless me.
He realizes he's wrong.
Yes. But what is he asking Moses to do?
Forgive him.
To forgive him.
To bless him. If someone has treated you like this, in this way, is it easy to bless them? No. So why? What's going on there?
Moses has to forgive him.
Yeah, Moses has to be free. Yeah? Moses has to ask for God's blessing upon his enemy. He has to love his enemy. He has to pray for God's blessing upon the person who has made life so miserable, destroyed the country, reduced everyone to slavery. He has to care about this person and love this person and ask for God's blessing upon this person. And that's the only way that Moses himself and the Israelites could be free. Yes? If they left Egypt without any trace of resentment or bitterness or hatred, yes, then they could move forwards instead of being trapped. Yeah? Really important things these. Also bless me. The Israelites asked the Egyptians for silver and gold. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they left on in this kind of way. Exodus. I personally think I've lost my schedule. What time? I drowned it. Sorry. That knocking over the glass of water is supposed to happen about now. Crossing the Red Sea. To 3. Okay. Ooh, 10 minutes. Okay. Personally, I think this is probably where the crossing probably took place. About here. There's a sort of land bridge here, and the tide goes out. It used to appear. It's sort of washed away now. So that's probably where this crossing took place. It fits in with the biblical record. Anyway. Okay. So when Moses led the people out of Egypt, then this is a speech he gave. And you might think, well, what kind of speech, what kind of rallying speech is he going to give to the people? Is he going to talk about the land of milk and honey? Is he going to talk about this, freedom, or all these things? This is what he taught. And this is the speech he gave when they left Egypt. He said, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." That's the vertical relationship. "And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." Yeah? This is what Moses said. Love God and teach your children. Yes? That was what he said. And tell your children about all the things that God has done for us. Okay? So they're telling these stories. The most important thing, love God, teach your children. That's the vertical line, isn't it? If you don't pass on this to your children, you don't tell your children the stories, then they will lose their sense of who they are. That makes sense? They will lose their identity. So love God, teach your children. So this is the role of a teacher. As it says, this is Maimonides saying, "Respect and reverence for your teacher should be greater even than respect and reverence for your parents. Because parents bring you into this world, while teachers give you entrance to the world to come." where you go to in the next world. If a city has made no provision for the education of the young, this is the Jewish law, if a city's made no provision for the education of the young, its inhabitants are placed under a ban until teachers are being engaged. If they persistently neglect this duty, the city is excommunicated, for the world only survives by the merit of the breath of school children. Yeah? This is the core, this is what Moses said, love God, teach your children. This is more important for Jews, the Hebrews, than anything else, is to pass on the stories. And if a Jewish community doesn't have, for them it wouldn't be Sunday school, it would be on the Sabbath, then they are put under a ban, they'll be excommunicated. If you don't pass on the stories, then you are failing as a community. So again, this is Michael Oakeshott, an English educationist. There's an ancient Oriental image of human life which recognizes this account of our circumstance. In it, the child is understood to owe its physical life to its parents, a debt to be acknowledged with appropriate respect, but initiation into the Gestaltwelt, did I pronounce that well?
Geistige Welt.
Can you give us a translation?
Spiritual.
Spirit world, okay. Initiating the spiritual world of human achievement is owed to the sage, the teacher, and this debt is to be acknowledged with the profoundest reverence. For to whom can a man be more deeply indebted than to the one to whom he owes not his mere existence, but his participation in human life? It is the sage, the teacher, who is the agent of civilization. Okay, so this is really important then. That's why Father talks about becoming a true parent, a true teacher, and a true owner. Okay? Is it easy to have children or hard to have children? Well, is it okay? Is it easy to make babies or not?
Yes.
Making babies is quite easy. Sometimes, but generally speaking, for most people, making babies is easy. Is it easy to bring children up? No. That's the hard part, isn't it? Yeah, that's the. Okay, so that you parent, you make babies, you feed them, you take care of them, you clothe them, and all that, which is something that parents naturally do. You know, wolves do it, birds do it. That's just a normal thing that all parents do. Love, and even willing to risk their life for the sake of their children. Yeah? All animals do that. But the other aspect is one has to teach one's children, yes, how to behave. Pass on the stories, doing hunduke, so they develop this sense of identity of who they are, yes? This is really important and it's not easy, okay? And the true owner, well, that's another aspect, okay? So, this is really important. And one has to think about our own spiritual community. Have we done that? In Sweden, to be honest, when I went to Chongpyeong, I used to teach there, and I couldn't understand. Like Sean was there, and China was there. Why are there so many Swedish people here? Why are there so many Swedish children here? Sweden is just a little country, but there's so many Swedish kids. Completely out of proportion for what one would expect. So I thought, well, let's go and see what's going on in Sweden. And I found, Tim was there. So, okay. Invited him over to England and taught some workshops, found out doing Sunday school and everything. Okay, now I understand why a larger proportion of Swedish children go to Chongpyeong, go to STF, go to the Blessing, and are still involved in our spiritual community than any other country in the world. Yep. I don't know which giant Tim was fighting, but anyway, so that was, and people say, well, it's because they're all living together and they've got a kindergarten together. And I said, look, a similar sized community in other cities in Europe and other parts of the world and other countries, but such a high proportion, what's different? I would say a very well developed Sunday school program, and unfortunately, our church as an institution never invested anything for the education of our children, except Tim here. But in America, Korea, Japan, almost nothing was invested in the education of good educational materials. So many young people I've come across, they hate the divine principle. Why? Because they were taught the divine principle in the way that you would teach an adult the divine principle. Yeah?
In Korea in the 50s.
It's
And adult in Korea in the 50s.
all over the place. You know, the reason I could understand and appreciate the divine principle, because I was brought up as a Christian. Going to Sunday school, I knew all these stories, and so I could understand and appreciate the principle, explanation, and analysis of these stories. And I was also, 18, 19. But I know for many years, young kids were given divine principle lectures, as adults would have been given. And they got bored out of their mind and turned off the principle. That's dreadful. Instead of producing age-appropriate materials, as Tim did, age-appropriate materials that could be used for the children's education all over the world. That makes sense? We didn't do that. Yeah? And I think that's why we're struggling a lot, I think. One of the main reasons, I would say. So, what are you going to build? So this is what the Egyptians built. Huge pyramids, yes? Okay, because the Pharaoh was buried, because the Pharaoh was the god. Okay, is there anything left of Egyptian culture today from 4,000 years ago? Nothing. They're all Muslims today. None of them read hieroglyphics. None of them pass on the stories from 4,000 years ago. All is left are these buildings. This is what the Greeks built, the Parthenon. But as Greek culture and society exist in the same way that it existed 4,000, 2,000, over 2,000 years ago? It doesn't, does it? They're all Orthodox Christians now. The Romans, they built the Colosseum. Is ancient Roman culture still alive? No. And the Jews built synagogues. And synagogues are just places where they teach. Are the Jews still around? Yes. They're the only people still around with the same culture that they had from 3,500 years ago. Yeah, only people around in the world today, because they invested in education of their children. They invested in the continuation of a lineage, yes? Not in houses, buildings, but in the house of their lineage. Okay, so we should have done the same. I don't know if it's too late for us, but it's what we should have done. Okay, what to teach? Well, yeah.
I mean, they did it because they were God's chosen people, right? They didn't do it because they were Jews.
Well, what made them Jews was, this is what Moses said. Moses then was a very wise person, and that's what he told the people to do. And that's what they did. They invested in the education of their children. And other people... Sorry?
Because of Heavenly Parent.
Well, because that's what they believed was important.
Because they were the chosen people.
Can we come on to the chosen bit a bit later?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, it can't be too late for us now because we are, anyhow, yeah.
I mean, you can be chosen. I mean, as it says on predestination, many are called but few are chosen. Somebody may be chosen for a particular mission, but it all depends upon whether that person fulfills a responsibility or not. Yes, that's the chapter on predestination. We may be chosen, but it's just not. That's not enough. Yes.
Moses could have chosen to shut his mouth and say nothing.
Yeah.
But he.
Well, yes. Despite the fact he was a stutterer, and the people knew he was a stutterer, he couldn't speak, and so they knew that it was actually God's words coming through him. So these are his speeches. I mean, there's other things that God said, but these are the speeches that he gave. And you could say, well, God was speaking through him. Or you could say, well, actually, this was coming through his original mind. He actually thought about all these things, and that is what he felt was the most important thing. Yeah, if you want to move people from slavery into freedom, you have to change the way they think, the way they feel, the way they relate, the way they behave. Yeah, everything. There's what in here that has to change. And that change has to come through education. But then what to teach? As it says here, when the time comes and your son asks you, what does this mean? You tell him, God brought us out of Egypt and out of the house of slavery with a profound hand. So the first thing here is that children then are encouraged to ask questions. Ask questions. Why do we do this? What is the meaning of this? Yes? And we have to be able to give good answers, to be able to explain to the children so they can understand, to encourage questioning. Now, I'm always asking questions, very annoying sometimes. But my mother, she's Jewish by birth, but she went to a Catholic convent, when she's a teenager. My mother's always asking questions, and the nuns always used to say to her, "You shouldn't ask questions, it's a mystery." Yes? Okay? And so my mother then felt really uncomfortable about asking questions because the nuns, representing God, told her it's a mystery, you just have to believe, you shouldn't question. Okay? That's not a good way of bringing kids up. The biblical tradition is to encourage children to ask questions, to question everything and be really skeptical until they come to find out the answer for themselves. Yeah? That's the way our community used to be when I joined as well. Question, ask questions. Don't believe it just because I say it. That's why I tell people when I'm teaching the principle, second gen, I say, there's you can tell whether Uncle William is saying something which is right or wrong. There's something inside yourself which tells you, is what he's saying right or wrong? That is what you should listen to. Listen to the voice inside yourself. It will tell you whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. Okay? And I'm listening to myself talking as well. Sometimes I'm talking and I say, "Oh, that's wrong, shouldn't have said that." Or, "That's right, yeah, that's good." Yeah? That's the way it works. One should always be listening. Yeah? That's the main commandment, is to listen. Yeah? And to pass on these stories so that they have meaning. And our own children, sometimes they think, well, why do we bow down in front of a table full of fruit? Yes? All these kind of questions. We don't explain. We need to find stories to explain all these things so they become meaningful. Without a story, it has no meaning. Yes? We need stories to give all the things that we do meaning. Yeah? And unfortunately, we don't have these stories, I don't think, in our spiritual community that make these things that we do as meaningful as they should be. Anyway, that's what it says in the principle. I almost finished this bit. People can never find the path that leads to life without understanding the particulars of the providence of restoration. Here lies the reason why we must study the principle of restoration in detail. Okay, so last year when I was here, I spent 2 days just looking at the stories in Genesis in detail. But to be perfectly honest, I was just touching on a few points. Yeah, there's so much here which is so interesting. We really need to study these stories in detail. The divine principle itself doesn't go into these stories in detail. Yeah, it just touches a few little points here and here to prove the conclusion, Father's the Messiah. Yes? But we have to study all these stories in the Bible in detail. Why is it that 3,500 years later, the Jewish people are still there? It's a historical mystery. Yeah? Why? A person who does not know the history of the last 3,000 years wanders in darkness of ignorance, unable to make sense of the reality around him. Yeah? 3,000 years. And don't know the last 3,000 years of history, you're living from hand to mouth, Goethe said. And Churchill said, the further back you can look, the further forward you're likely to be able to see. Okay, and one last thing here. Confucius, if your plan is for 1 year, plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, plant trees. If your plan is for 100 years, educate children. Okay? So sometimes I used to go, I'm not a great meeting person, but from time to time we used to go to European leaders' meetings, and sometimes people say, "Are you a church leader?" And I would say, "No. I'm much more important than a church leader. I'm a Sunday school teacher." And they'd think, "What are you talking about?" For me, when I came back to England from Russia, I just taught Sunday school for teenagers every Sunday for 10 years. I felt there's nothing more important that I can do than that. Yeah? And so, I said most church leaders looked at me like, what kind of a person are you? You think you're better than me? But that's what I feel is the most important thing. If we want to continue, we have to invest the best that we have in the education of children and developing educational programs within the family, good kind of educational programs for Hunduke, good kind of things for Sunday school, and also when people go to university, so they can see how to apply the principle to your studies at university. The principle is a profound analysis of the humanities and as science. And if people could understand it at that level, our kids would make an incredible contribution to the world of scholarship, to the world of culture, to the whole world, if they can understand the principle deeply and how to apply it. Well, we haven't done that, unfortunately. I think the Divine Principle book is a work of genius, absolute genius. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to translate it into common sense, into something easier. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much.